Steve, I'd like to start with a fairly classical question. We've been teaching MBAs for over 100 years. We think we teach them management, finance, marketing, operations, strategy, but it seems to me that there's something missing in the classical MBA program. What is missing in a typical MBA program for somebody who wants to be an entrepreneur?
You know, how many of you have MBAs? Everything you learned, if you got your degree in the last, earlier than 3 years ago, is obsolete. Congratulations. And at least for entrepreneurship, not if you want to run a large company. I want to remind those of you who don't have an MBA what it actually stands for. MBA is the Master of Business Administration. Big idea, administration. The notion of the MBA, first graduating MBA class in the United States was Harvard in 1908, and the notion was to create a management class to run these new corporations that were actually forming in the United States. Steel companies, oil companies, food companies that were actually growing in scale and size, and there wasn't a professional management class. And so we decided to actually have a curriculum to educate administrators, people who could execute an existing company. So the curriculum for the MBA was how to run an existing company. The big idea,
start the one.
How to run one. And it's not that we never understood that there were these things called startups, because in 1940, George Deroe at Harvard offered essentially the first entrepreneurship class. Stanford in the 1950s offered small business entrepreneurship classes. But here was the big idea. And this big idea actually is what kicked off the lean startup movement, is that a startup is not a smaller version of a large company. This is a huge idea. Nowadays, it's kind of like, well, we kind of understand that, but when I was an entrepreneur, that was not the case. Our investors taught us to do everything a large company did. A large company wrote a business plan, we wrote a business plan. A large company did a 5-year forecast, they made us do a 5-year forecast. A large company hired sales, marketing, business development VPs on day one. They told us to do that, and more importantly, our investors assumed that all we needed to do was execute the business plan just like a large company. Yet they were surprised when 90-some-odd% of us would fail. And they blamed it on us as the entrepreneurs. The big idea that kicked off the lean startup movement was not only startups aren't smaller versions of large companies, is that large companies execute known business models. What's a business model? Who's my customer? How do I price the product? Who's my competitors? What's my distribution channel? How do I get, keep, and grow customers? In a large company, you're large because you know that. And therefore, you hire people to execute. But in a startup, the thing that you're all doing, you're actually searching for a business model. And that's the core distinction in the lean startup movement. We built tools for 100 years for execution, but we had no tools. We didn't even have a language to describe that what we're actually doing is searching for a business model. What was your question?
It's wonderfully answered. I think it's a great spot to move in. What are some of the risks that an entrepreneur faces, and how would the entrepreneur mitigate them if the MBA program is not going to do it for them?
So one of the biggest both benefits and problems with being a founder of a company is a founder is driven by passion and faith. And in fact, on day one, a startup is closer to a religious organization than anything else. You're actually driven by your belief that you see something that no one else does. And in fact, that is not only the reason that you will succeed, that's also the reason why you will fail. Because very quickly, for a startup to succeed, you need to turn that faith into facts as rapidly as possible. The mistake is simply thinking that just because you believe, then therefore it exists. And the whole idea about the lean startup movement says, there are no facts inside your building. So why don't you get outside and try to get some facts as early as possible? And that was my contribution in this portion called customer development. And so the lean startup movement actually does 3 things. It says, let's take all your hypotheses. And by the way, I use this word hypotheses because at Stanford, where I teach, the students pay $50,000 a year, and their parents want to know they're learning very big words. But outside of Stanford, the word hypotheses means guess. And if you really think about it, most of your startups are based around a series of untested guesses. Though you might believe, and you might have convinced other employees to join, and you might have convinced even investors to give you some money, the odds are most of what you have are a series of untested guesses. And what we're going to do is have you write down those guesses, and we're going to use something called the Business Model Canvas by someone named Alexander Osterwalder. I would have added Alex's book to your reading list. His book is called Business Model Generation. And in one single diagram, one piece of paper, we could put all your guesses. All your guesses. Who are the customers? What am I building for them? What's the distribution channel? How do I get, keep, and grow them? What are the profits and losses and costs, etc.? And then the second thing we're going to do is get out of the building physically, and sometimes virtually, and test those hypotheses by doing the third thing, agile engineering and building minimum viable products. And so the lean startup consists of those three pieces: business model design to articulate or write down your hypotheses, customer development to get out and test them, and agile engineering to physically build iterative and incremental versions of the product before you ever do what we used to call first customer ship. In the lean method, you're continually testing the product almost from day one. And it's not just code. It could be a PowerPoint slide, could be wireframe, could be just data to get some early customer feedback. And what's interesting is the lean startup is basically maybe 5 years old. Yet MBAs have had 100 years of management stack, and we're just building kind of our stack of tools for entrepreneurs. Osterwalder came up with a business model canvas. I came up with customer development. Eric Ries came up with the insight that agile engineering is the best way to build MVPs. And so all of us have been adding to this management stack, and others, all the books you mentioned as well. And so entrepreneurship and tools for entrepreneurs, all of you are now the beneficiary in the 21st century of all this new thinking on how to think about startups. Again, I want to emphasize, if you're doing the same thing you would have done in a large company, you are going to go out of business. It's a big idea. Don't believe that just because you think so, it's going to happen.
Wonderful. Do you start with a product and try to find market for it, or do you identify a market and then build a product for it? A lot of students come up to me and say, I have this idea, do you think it'll work? And I'm sure it happens to you as well. What do you tell them?
Yes. So the answer is, you could start on either end. If you're a technologist, then in Silicon Valley, our history is we started with products in search of customers. In fact, that's why I invented the customer development process, because every startup I ever did was semiconductors or supercomputers, or we had some great technology invention, and then they said, oh, let's go find some business. Other people actually might come out of a space where they actually understood the customers and are looking for products that could serve them. In either case, the two most important things you're searching for as entrepreneurs, as the founding team, is this fit between product and customer. And this fit is called product market fit. You can't go further in your startup unless you have found product market fit. And product market fit is very simple. Are people grabbing the product out of your hands and saying, I want it, or I'm using it, or I'm buying it, or I've given you email addresses, or I'm downloading it, or some evidence that people actually like what your vision is? Every once in a while, I get a student who's taken my class, does a startup, and then I have coffee with them, and they say, Professor Blank, the customers aren't behaving as I think. And so sometimes I just kind of get exasperated and say, well, maybe we should ship a copy of your plan, with the product. And they write down, ship copy of plan with product. And I go, no, that's not what you should be doing. You should be finding out why they're not behaving as you expect. And by the way, customers never never behave as you expect. Never.
And they don't know what they want either.
They don't know, and you believe you know. Which, by the way, as an aside, I was in the speed dating session, and I'm impressed that almost every entrepreneur here in Istanbul can do a 30-second pitch just like at Y Combinator. That's the good news. The bad news is, I think that's irrelevant. What I'm really interested in, and so should you, is not how glib or how easy you could describe your company. I'm really interested in, what did you think? What did you find? Then what did you do? And then where are you now? I want to understand, where did you start from, and how much did you learn? These 30-second pitches just tell me that here's how smart you think you are right now. I'm really interested if you didn't learn anything in the last 6 months, I'm running away because I don't think you actually learned anything. I want to understand, well, here's what I thought when I started the company. Here's what happened when we shipped some minimum viable products. Here's what happened when the customers didn't work the way we thought they would, or pricing or competitors, et cetera. And so here's what we're doing. That journey is actually a lot more interesting because it teaches me the velocity and trajectory of the teams. Now, that scares some investors, but to be honest, I wouldn't want to take money from people who are interested in a fancy PowerPoint slide. I'd be interested in people who want to invest in somebody who learns rapidly and is able to actually match the market.
You said minimum viable product. How do we know what's viable, what's minimal, and are there risks associated with the minimum viable product? That is one of the building blocks of the lean startup movement, isn't it?
This word MVP is overused, but very relevant. A minimum viable product is whatever you could build to learn the most at a certain point of time. And if you're an engineer, the immediate reaction is, oh, I get it, it's a defeatured version of the product. It's, some of the features are missing. And that just misses the point. That's not what an MVP is. An MVP on day one could be a PowerPoint slide of the UI. Or it could be a spreadsheet with the data you're going to provide a customer. Or it could be a wireframe. Or it could be even a conversation. An MVP changes over time, and what you're trying to do is maximize learning. It could simply be different price points. It could be A/B testing of pricing, which has nothing to do with the product. That is, what I'm trying to do is learn about customer segments, revenue model, customer acquisition, costs, volume, et cetera, correct channel, right partners. And so the minimum viable product is not a smaller version of the finished product. It might be, but almost often is not in the beginning of the company. And in fact, it's almost worth reminding people what a startup is. When I was an entrepreneur, I always thought a startup was the things I did, which is I woke up in the morning and figured out how I was going to take over the entire world, if not the entire universe, and that's what a startup was. But I realized that there were a variety of definitions. In Silicon Valley, a startup is the place where you get free food and get to bring your dog. But you're not allowed to bring your children. I never figured that one out. So I came up with a definition which might be helpful. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model.
That's really tight. Would you like to open that up for us a little bit?
I will, but it was designed to be like, you could say it in a sentence. Yeah. So number one is, I used to love startups. I did 8 of them, mostly because I was unemployable in a large company, so I had to do startups. A startup is a temporary organization, which means the goal of a startup is not to become a startup. What's the goal of a startup?
To grow.
To grow, to become a large company. So I put the word temporary organization just to remind ourselves that the goal is not to stay as a startup. Designed to search. Boy, that's interesting. I thought the goal of a startup is to grow and sell stuff or get sold or whatever. Actually, the goal of a startup, that early phase, is to answer a bunch of questions about your business model. It's a big idea. The goal in the early days is not to hire people and execute like you think you're correct. In fact, the data says while you think you're a visionary, there's enough data across the world now to say you're not a visionary, you're hallucinating. It's a big idea. And so therefore, instead of wasting your time, we want you to search for a business model. Who are the customers? What's the right price? What's the right feature set? What's the right product market fit? And the way I want to do this is I want to get some evidence that this thing is the right business model, and I'll use MVPs to do that. But I'm looking for something that's repeatable. That is, I could do the same thing on Monday that works on Wednesday, that works next week, and scalable. That means for an input of 100 lira, I might get 200 lira back. Or for an input of a certain amount of dollars, I'll acquire so many customers. And so that's what the definition means. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for repeatable and scalable business model.
I think it's worth repeating. Startup is a temporary organization in search of repeatable and scalable business model. It's worth thinking about also. Another important component of the lean startup is the pivot.
Yes.
When do you decide to pivot? I think that most of the entrepreneurs I know have this emotional attachment to their idea, to their product. How could they possibly let go? Maybe they're leaving a diamond in the rough, or maybe it is the right time to move. How do they know it's time to pivot?
So first, let's define what a pivot is, right? And so, a good number of entrepreneurs, particularly founding CEOs, think a pivot is simply, I changed my mind. That's not a valid definition of a pivot. It might explain entrepreneurs with attention deficit disorder, but it really isn't a good definition. My definition of a pivot is a substantive change to one or more of the business model components. Again, that seems fancy and complicated, but if you really think about it, a pivot says, I've gotten out of the building and discovered that my customers aren't, men 28 to 35 in Istanbul. My customers might actually be, broader in the whole Middle Eastern region. That's a pretty big insight, and therefore you'll pivot who your customer segment is. Or you might decide that your revenue model, it's not freemium. Oh my gosh, we figured out we can actually charge for the product. That's a substantive pivot. And so you have found something specifically about a part of the business model that you need to change. The other piece about the pivot, by the way, is that what we kind of enforce is you can't just go out and say, here's what I heard yesterday, and change the whole company. In fact, I have a 72-hour hold on any pivots for founders. You're not allowed to go from your brain to your mouth for 72 hours, or else you jerk your company around in a very bad way.
That's sleeping over the idea.
You have to sleep on it for 3 days. Talk to your board, talk to some advisors, talk to some mentors, but ultimately you really need to think about whether you want to pivot, because these are real changes to either engineering or sales or whatever. The pivot, though, does something else, and it's not intuitively obvious. In the old days, 20th century, and maybe some of you are still practicing this, is what we used to do is write a business plan. A very nice document. A business plan is defined in the 21st century as the document that your investors made you write that they never read. I'm supposed to laugh here. This is...
It's a different sense of humor in this country.
Right,
so.
yeah. Maybe we're still writing business plans. And by the way, the best part of the business plan was a 5-year plan, a forecast in the back, which forecasted, essentially, if you think about it, for a startup, a series of unknowns. Now, what's interesting is a business plan makes all the sense in the world in a large company when you have a series of knowns. I know my customers. I know my channel. Here's my next product. I could write a business plan. The mistake we made was taking that same document and trying to apply it for a series of unknowns. Now, I have to remind you, the only people who had 5-year plans with a series of unknowns who required 5-year plans that way were venture capitalists in the Soviet Union. And we know how well they turned out for at least one of those groups. And I'm not suggesting we don't need planning. I am suggesting that the process ended up doing some absurd things. Here's what happened. When you would write a business plan and you'd get money from an investor, they would look at that 5-year forecast, and then you would have board meetings. And in Silicon Valley, we'd have board meetings every 6 weeks, and they'd ask you, how are you doing per plan?
Compare.
And you were supposed to execute that plan. It didn't matter that you were getting new data from customers that said the plan was obsolete. The board funded that plan. You would ship the product, and you'd have a launch party. Everybody would be happy. And then a couple months later, people would be asking the VP of sales, how are we doing per plan? And the VP of sales would always say, great pipeline. Now, for those of you who've never done that, great pipeline means we really don't have any sales, and it's going to come, but don't worry. And this would repeat multiple board meetings until one day the board would fire and the CEO would fire the VP of sales.
That's a pivot, isn't it?
Why? We're not executing the plan. And so we would continue, a new VP of sales would say, well, that was a stupid plan. Here's the new plan. By the way, when they said, here's a new plan, we were actually doing a pivot. And this would continue for another 6 months, and if it still wasn't working, we'd fire the VP of marketing. Why? Because it can't be the VP of sales' problem, it's VP of marketing. And the new VP of marketing would come in and say, well, here's the new positioning. We just did another pivot. And then finally, if we're still not making money or not meeting our plan, we fire the CEO. Now, if you think about this, the one thing we never fired was the plan. It's a big idea. The one thing we never said is perhaps our initial assumptions were incorrect. Yet we now know, after doing startups for 30 or 40 years, it's the very rare startup that gets the initial assumptions correct. And therefore, the business model canvas and the lean methodology says, hey, those are the things we're changing first. We fire the plan first before we fire the people. That's a big idea. And that's why this whole lean methodology makes people from large companies incredibly uncomfortable. In fact, it's why large company executives, and sometimes why government officials who need certainty, have a hard time understanding the uncertain nature of early stage ventures. By definition, they're unstable and unknowns. We're solving for multiple unknowns.
This is actually a good point to dive into some local material.
Yep.
A lot of the angels in Turkey are asking questions about ROI and EBITDAs and 5-year financials and so on. And what I'm recommending to our entrepreneurs is if they have an investor that wants those types of things, come to me. I have a group of creative writers who can create wonderful pitch decks and just give them what they want. So maybe a lesson for angel investors: do not treat startups like you would treat mature companies.
So that brings up another subject, which, by the way, used to confuse me. When I've retired as an entrepreneur and started teaching, I thought entrepreneurship was pretty well defined. That is, everybody knew what an entrepreneur was. It was somebody who wanted to start a billion-dollar business or go broke. And one of my mentors at Berkeley suggested, Steve, perhaps you ought to sit in through some other entrepreneurship classes and see what they're teaching. And I sat through those classes and realized that their definition of entrepreneurship was very different than mine.
So what were they doing wrong?
Well, no, they weren't doing, actually, in this case, a very rare event, I was wrong. It turns out, and this is true in every country, and Turkey in particular, it's worth thinking about. It turns out the word entrepreneur and startup means different things to different people. Yeah. And this really screws up investors, government, and educators without having a taxonomy, that is a kind of a set of buckets about what kind of startups are we talking about. Let me give you a set of examples. There's a certain type of entrepreneur which I call a lifestyle entrepreneur, maybe more prevalent in the United States, but these are people whose life really isn't about startups. Their life is about something else. I happen to live near the ocean, and some of my friends are surfers. And if they could, they would surf in the water 24 hours a day. But they have to pay the bills, so they set up their own business right? At a Surf Shack, it says surfing lessons, 9:15 to 10:30. And they are entrepreneurs, and they have a startup, but they have no real interest in building that as a business. Their passion is somewhere else. Those are lifestyle entrepreneurs. There's a second type of entrepreneur which exists in all countries, which are small business entrepreneurs. Yeah. They have been around forever.
This is the biggest confusion in Turkey,
yes.
by the way.
And by the way, it's the biggest confusion in every country. And by the way, why this is important is the teams are different, financing is different, scale is different, how you teach them is different, how the government supports them is different. And it's not that anyone is right or wrong, they're just different. Small business entrepreneurs are the majority of entrepreneurs in any country. These are people who want to open a grocery store or dry cleaners or nowadays a website or want to be a database consultant. And they want to feed the family and maybe their extended family, and if they're lucky, they could buy a car or a second house or something, but they have no interest in and maybe no capacity to take over the world. Their interest is just not working for someone else and having their own business. And teaching them how to do that is an honorable profession, and having government support for them to do that. But Absolutely. They need to understand is that they are not going to raise venture capital. They typically raise money from friends and family. In the US, there's government support for that as well, I assume in Turkey also, as well. And those are the core of entrepreneurship. And in fact, having that culture is great. But what we talk about in Silicon Valley is much different. So there's another category which we call, or I call, scalable startups. A scalable startup is a crazy person, right? A small business entrepreneur is a rational person. A scalable startup wakes up and says, I am going to change not Istanbul, not Turkey, but I'm going to change the entire world. Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Zuckerberg, all the names that are familiar here. These people have a global view, and they will build a team of extraordinary people with a vision that encompasses billions of people, and will figure out how to raise the capital to scale. And because the potential returns are huge, they sometimes can attract that capital. Now, those used to be those three categories. But it turns out, around the turn of this century, something wonderful happened. And what happened is a confluence of a set of activities that no one could have predicted. One is the explosion of broadband. That is the ability to have the internet not only everywhere, but everywhere fast. Turkey is a great example. Two is the explosion of smartphones in the hands of not millions, but billions of people. There's now a platform that has more computing in your hand that when I grew up as an entrepreneur in the 70s that existed probably in all of Silicon Valley. And the third part is computing as a utility. Amazon Web Services is now the platform, just like electricity, for doing computing. You no longer have to buy computers. In fact, the price of doing a software startup in my lifetime, since the 1970s, has dropped by a factor of 1,000. It used to cost $4 million to even start a software company. You had to buy what was called a VAX, a mini computer, for $1 million. You had to buy software that went on the VAX for another $1 million. Because you used waterfall engineering as a methodology of building products, it took 2 to 3 years to get products out the door. So you had to pay another $1 million for your staff. And then because you were always late, you needed another $1 million anyway. Today, almost everybody in this room could start something on their credit cards and their laptop in their dorm. And so that explosion of entrepreneurship on platforms and devices, whether they're on Android or iOS, now allows us to think about another class of startups. And those are what I'll call buyable startups. Startups that actually can exit for anywhere from a couple $1 million to $500 million to $1 billion. But the cost of entry, not the ultimate cost, but the cost of entry is available to everybody in this room. And sometimes we forget, because it's so easy to get in here, that there are other startups in hardware and life sciences and biotech, et cetera. But the entrepreneurship is everywhere explosion happened because literally this factor of 1,000 has been the largest change ever, in any time. So where I wanted to get back to is, when you think about entrepreneurship now, you need to ask the question, what kind of entrepreneurs are we talking about? By the way, there's a fourth type, which is every large corporation is now being disrupted continually. China as a manufacturer, China as a supplier. Every startup is now attacking large companies. People used to be dominant suppliers for decades are now finding that they're being chased by new entrants who never existed before. So large companies are also struggling to do what we call continuous innovation. And for corporations who were set up to be execution machines, having to figure out how to do innovation is incredibly difficult inside that structure. So now we have another type of startup, which is
corporate entrepreneurs.
Corporate entrepreneurs. And by the way, I'll throw in social entrepreneurs, NGOs, as another category. So why I say this is for both investors, for entrepreneurs, for government, for educators. When you're talking about entrepreneurship, you should be asking, so which one am I investing in? And I should also be asking, how do I want to support them? And what's the right tools? And what's the right investment strategy?
Now, we see more and more entrepreneurs, and what we see with the entrepreneurs is, of course, failure. Great majority fail. Now, the stigma around failures in Turkey is quite different from that in the US because of cultural and historical reasons. What is the importance or significance of failures? Could you perhaps excite us a little bit about failures?
You know what we call a failed entrepreneur in the United States? Special word in English. Do you know what we call them? You know? Experienced.
Experience, yeah.
It's a big idea. It's a huge idea. You're in the right entrepreneurial cluster, and that is Silicon Valley's a cluster, New York's a cluster, London, Stockholm, Berlin, Herzliya, hopefully Istanbul, is where a failed entrepreneur doesn't shame their family, doesn't shame their community, and in fact, and like everybody, failure isn't good. It feels horrible. I've failed 4 times. But you're in a successful cluster when your best friend has coffee with you and his first question is, so what's your next startup? It's a big idea. And your investors not only call you back, they're asking the same question. This is a cultural thing because people confuse startups with existing companies. An existing company, a failure was, well, wait a minute, you were supposed to execute a known business model and you failed.
You screwed that up, yeah.
Right? The job spec was understood, you had customers, you lost that. How did you do that? A startup is a whole series of unknowns. And in fact, I want to remind the audience, how many of you are founders? Founders. Come on, more, really? More. All right. Turns out that whatever your career was in the past, you've just given it up. Because a founder of a company is closer to an artist than any other profession. If you think about an artist, a sculptor, a painter, a composer, they see something that no one else sees. They hear something that no one else sees. They start with a blank canvas or a blank score sheet. And at first, they're the only one who can envision or hear what there is. Beethoven was deaf, right, when he did the Ninth Symphony. And somehow, through their passion and vision, they're able to convince other people to join them, to kind of practice this piece or look at this blank sheet or look at this block of marble and believe there will be a beautiful sculpture here. And they're also can convince investors to give them money for some quest. But just like artists, sometimes they fail. And we don't shoot artists because they made a bad painting. They just go do another one. And much like artists, we know how to teach artists. We've learned during the Renaissance. We teach them some theory, perspective, color, etc. But then we give them a ton of hands-on and practice, experiential. And this is what we missed with entrepreneurship education, is that we confused it. This is back to your initial MBA question of sitting in the class and doing case studies. You don't do case studies for painting. You actually go out and paint.
Get out of the building.
And for entrepreneurship, and this is back to the failure thing, the failure is actually equals experience, not failure. You don't paint one painting and end up, with a masterpiece. You paint lots of paintings. And so this is part of the education of the greater community, that a failure in a startup is not the same as the failure in a large corporation.
And success is going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm.
There we go.
Churchill said.
The Churchill's comment.
Yeah. I tell my students that a startup
Except at Gallipoli.
Except at Gallipoli, yes. Ran against a tough enemy there. I tell my students that an entrepreneur will never fail. A startup could fail, but the probability of failure goes down with every new attempt. And eventually...
So this goes back to the passion of an artist. This is where I keep using that analogy. Being an artist is the world's most miserable job. You would never do it for the money. If you were doing it for the money, you're doing the wrong profession. You do it for the passion. And it's the same as doing it as a founder. You will be, for sure, encountering times where your co-founder has just quit, your largest customer just told you they changed their mind, and your best employee just left, and that was just Tuesday. I've had that happen. And if you're thinking that entrepreneurship is a job, you will give up. For those of you who want to be entrepreneurs because you're thinking it's cool, you're confused. Entrepreneurship is not a job, it's a calling. It's a calling. If you don't hear the voice in your head that says, I can't imagine not doing anything else but this, go take a job somewhere else until you get tired of it and hear that voice. And I'm not talking about employees. Employees of a startup are different. But the founders have to be called for this mission of wanting to do something, and they can't imagine, and they just can't believe that there's actually such a career. It's just like, again, being called to being a painter or a composer. You can't imagine doing anything else. I did this for 21 years in Silicon Valley as a practicing entrepreneur, and I can't tell you how many times driving to work, I was wondering if they were going to make me pay to work there because I enjoyed it. So I couldn't believe I could actually have a job like inventing new things and learning new stuff and getting paid to kind of create things and, most of the time failing. In fact, my next to last company, I was on the cover of Wired magazine. I don't know if they still have Wired. It used to be something they killed dead trees and put ink on it and published magazine. And I raised $35 million. And 90 days after I was on the cover of Wired, I realized I was going out of business. And the company eventually failed. And I had to call my mother. And my mother was a Russian immigrant, and English was never her first language. So every time I spoke to her, there was a pause as she translated in her head. And I said, Mom, I lost $35 million. Pause, translate. And she said, where'd you put it? I said, no, I lost it. It's all gone. Pause, longer pause. And then she said, oh my gosh, the country we came from is gone. There's nowhere for us to go. And then she got smarter, and then she said, and our name is blank. We can't even change it. I said, no. The people who gave me the money, the reason I'm calling you, just gave me another $12 million to do my next startup. And there was like, clunk. I thought she fell to the ground, and she had dropped the phone. And she said, they always told me the streets were paved with gold in the United States. And the reason I tell the story is not a Steve Blank story. By the way, that story had an interesting ending. The people gave me the $12 million. I returned $1 billion each.
Is that Epiphany?
It was Epiphany. $1 billion each to those investors. And that's not a Steve Blank story. That is an entrepreneurial cluster story. That's failure and redemption. And in fact,
wow.
I worked harder, and by the way, that failure did not feel good. Failure does not feel good. When people say fail fast and failure is fine, I don't know what they're talking about because failure is still pretty miserable. It's just the culture allows you to get up again, which is one of the characteristics of great entrepreneurs is you are resilient. If you are not resilient, if you cannot eventually bounce back, you're in the wrong business again. And the passion of being an entrepreneur is what gets you off the ground again. Sorry, what was the question?
Well, something about the Turkish market. The Turkish market, local market, is kind of in between. We're no Finland or Israel that has to look at the global markets, but we're no US or China. Right. We don't have a very large local market either. So a lot of Turkish entrepreneurs are sort of lulled into thinking they're successful by playing for the local market. Can you emphasize the significance of going global?
So a couple of things. Turkey with 76 million people?
Yeah.
76.8 or something, right.
Yeah.
Really is in that funny space because the population is almost of the size to have a nice, great, sustainable business. But I have found that if you're not born global, you tend to die local. And this really goes back to a more global question, if I can pop it up. Every country needs a regional playbook. And what I mean by that is a good number of you are reading TechCrunch or Y Combinator News. Anybody read that stuff for,
Bebrazi, the Turkish version.
Both investors and entrepreneurs. And while that's great base information, Turkey is not Mountain View or San Francisco. And every investor and every experienced entrepreneur, though, in Turkey has some local knowledge you've not shared with each other. And so I believe that what can be incredibly helpful is somebody to just start a blog or a wiki of here's some advice for entrepreneurs in Turkey. Here's some advice from investors in Turkey. Now, to answer your question, you could decide as an entrepreneur or investor, no. The Istanbul market, 20 million people, I'm investing in those. I'll put $50,000 in those startups. And gee, if they make $10 million, that's a great business. I want to do those. Or there might be other entrepreneurs who say, no, I'm going after the 76 million people, but I'm staying in Turkish and I'm staying in Turkey, and I'm going to build that kind of company. And maybe exits in there. I think the biggest example was that grocery shopping site that was acquired for $600 million. There's kind of an upper bound.
Yeah,
that's a nice market, and that's what I'm going to stay for. And there's another view which says, no, we want to be unicorns. We want to be valued at billions of dollars. My instinct is that's almost impossible to do just in Turkey. At minimum, you need to be thinking about region, if not the EU, and if not a global market. I will contend, though, that there's not a right answer.
Yeah.
There's a right match between investment dollars and return, and both the entrepreneur needs to understand the amount of scale they could get, and therefore the amount of money they could raise, and the investors need to have an investment strategy that says, oh, no, we only go for global companies. Or, no, we're happy for companies to just stay in the Turkish market because this is how we invest, and we'll be happy with those kind of returns. This knowledge is kind of known, but no one has written it down because, people tend to protect, oh, this is my secret sauce. I think that is a limitation of the entrepreneurial cluster in Turkey. I think that shouldn't be proprietary information. That should be information you're all sharing, because if you do a regional playbook, you'll all get collectively smarter. And accelerate, turn Istanbul into London fairly quickly, because you have all the right components here in Turkey. I mean, all the pieces, the great engineering talent. There's a financial infrastructure. I go to other clusters, and I just see smart entrepreneurs without any risk capital, meaning angel or VC. But in Turkey, I've been very surprised and pleasantly surprised that there's also risk capital. Because entrepreneurship without risk capital is like one hand clapping.
Yeah.
There's no noise. When you have both, you actually have the beginnings of a cluster. The other piece that is almost necessary, though not required, is government assistance.
Wonderful. You're actually answering my questions. Yeah. We're sort of telepathically speaking. Yeah. It's wonderful. That was going to be my last question. What do you think the government can do to expedite this?
Well, the first thought that most governments have is let's give out monies to
Yes.
startups. If there's anybody from the government in the room, please save your money.
Thank you, sir.
Uh,
That's what I've been saying for years.
the easier things for government to do, at least to entrepreneurs, which actually are harder for governments, is to eliminate the bureaucracy and paperwork for both starting businesses and, more importantly, this is a big idea. Entrepreneurial clusters are not job creation programs for the local populace. It's a big idea. If you're not attracting people from around the region and the world, then you don't yet have a cluster. And therefore, the government should make it incredibly easy for entrepreneurs from all around the Middle East to make Istanbul and Turkey the entrepreneurial center. Make it easy to attract people here. Make it easy for them to start businesses. Make it easy for them to bring talent and resources here.
Wonderful. And Startup Istanbul is actually a great opportunity to turn the city into, I don't want to say mecca of entrepreneurship, but a regional attraction center for the entire MENA region. Ladies and gentlemen, let me please join me in thanking Steve for this wonderful chat.
Great. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Great.
I think
Thank
it
you.
worked out well.
Thank you.